The world swore, never again. Yet another atrocious battle has unfolded before our eyes. In the past week, Aleppo's people have become military targets and victims of what some have described as war crimes. And many say the world has stood idle. Protests have been held across Europe and the Middle East, calling for governments to act, with many crying out that, like the Holocaust in Srebrenica, Syria's war will be a stain on our history, on our conscience, that we as global citizens have failed Syria's people.
I feel angry, but I also feel pretty helpless. I hope that something will finally change and that we don't fail all the time because of some veto.
I decided to come tonight because I've been watching what's happening in Aleppo for the past several weeks, and I'm ashamed because we're not doing anything.
But the atrocities in Aleppo have been happening across Syria for years. People believe red lines have been crossed, and the world hasn't responded. So is all this our fault? Syria's regime has been bolstered by its allies Russia and Iran, in both military and political might. Russia has repeatedly blocked UN Security Council resolutions to end abuses in Syria. President Barack Obama's failure to enforce his red line on chemical weapons may have raised the bar on what it would take for people to care or want to get involved in Syria's war, leaving many concerned global citizens feeling helpless. Although the rally cry is never again, Syria's war is also different from anything seen before. It's one of the first times we've had access to live, first-hand accounts from civilians trapped by the fighting.
That we are facing one of the most difficult massacre that is in the new history.
Is Syria's tragedy all of our responsibility? Or is this just the first time we've been so close and confronted by a conflict and been so powerless? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Wael Al-Harba. He's a freelance journalist who has reported in Syria, and from Glasgow, Idris Ahmed. He's a lecturer at the University of Stirling and co-edits the political blog pulsemedia.org. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Wael, let me start with you. As a Syrian, how do you feel that so many people are saying, hey, maybe this is our fault, we are collectively responsible for what's going on in Aleppo and in Syria in general, we should have done more, we should be ashamed of ourselves, whether it's somebody in Denmark or somebody in New Zealand?
It's shame on everyone, actually. We have been talking about this since 5 years, since the revolution started in Syria. We know this since 5 years, this is going to happen. This is what have been planned for, you know, to be in this situation now. So look at the regime, Syrian regime now, it's completely different. As they said, you know, what before Aleppo is not like after Aleppo. And look what's happening now. The Syrian now, the Syrian people, you know, they stop believing in human rights.
Mm-hmm. Would you understand why some people might be a little bit confused, though? For example, if somebody is just going through their Facebook feed, choose any random country, say somebody in Mexico going through their Facebook feed, and the one video they come across shows you the Russians and the regime committing atrocities in Aleppo, and the next video, they don't know much about sources, the next video shows them rebels burning these buses as people are being evacuated, and they're thinking, well, firstly, what can I do? And secondly, how do I even know who's right and who's wrong? Would you have some sort of sympathy for people on the outside who don't really know what's going on?
I know the problem since the beginning. It's what we see now in the whole news, actually. It's not reach 5% of what's going on the ground, you know, for reality. This is the problem. You know, and the Syrian regime with the Russian, with the Iranian, with the, you know, all the those allies, you know, they have their media, so they make so much propaganda, and as far they succeed. to make their propaganda, to make the people actually to confuse, or at least, to confuse the people, to believe what's going on the ground.
Let me bring in Idris. Idris, who's to blame? I mean, are we all to blame, or are there very specific belligerents involved here who we should be blaming, and should we cut ourselves some slack here?
Well, I think the failure goes on several levels. There's certainly public apathy, and apathy certainly has contributed to the political inaction as well. But the thing that you mentioned just now, that we have so much contradictory information, that has been critical, and I think that has been the outcome of a very deliberate propaganda and disinformation campaign. And it has come from, obviously, from the belligerent, which is the preeminent killer. So in this case, Russia and the regime. So what they have done is that they have planted disinformation, and very often it doesn't even take the form of a coherent story, it just takes the form of a whole lot of claims, contradictory claims. The idea is for people to just throw up their arms and they just say that we don't know what's happening. And they have been quite successful in that. I mean, they have been successful, and also I think in some respects, even the better media, like even the more responsible media, they have kind of they have failed to challenge that by failing to provide a sense of proportion. I mean, so as you mentioned, that there is one video making one claim, and then there's another video which is giving a completely contradictory story. But it's rather easy to find out. I mean, if we look at the balance of atrocities, and if we look at the balance of evidence, I mean, we have got human rights organizations, we have got independent media, then we have got international organizations like the UN, and we have got the ICRC, and then organizations like the medical charities like MSF or Physicians for Human Rights. So they're all giving a consistent story. We know where the balance of atrocities lies. We know who the primary killer is. But whenever we look at the media, so it obfuscates, it creates that false balance. It tries to give this impression that somehow this is an equal fight. And I think because of that, there is among the population or among the audiences, there is this tendency that, okay, there's no, the quote that goes around often is that it's that there are no good guys in this conflict. Right. And because of that, well, they can't do anything.
Yeah, talking about good guys and bad guys, while you were hit multiple times by Syrian regime snipers, right?
Yeah,
while you were filming, while you were working as a journalist. We've got some footage that you kindly shared with us when you were with Anita McNaught in Syria in 2013. It was fascinating because you were sort of hit by a sniper's bullet while you guys were trying to report from within Aleppo. And it was very compelling viewing. And do you blame, I guess, people for being suspicious of you because you had to be close to rebels to film from, say, within a place like Aleppo? There was a general suspicion, and we're playing this footage as if you can have a look over there. There was a general suspicion that those journalists, especially those Syrian journalists who happen to be embedded within Aleppo, must be dodgy. They must have some links with the rebels. They must have some links with the bad guys. The Russians and Iranians and others would go so far as to call you Al-Qaeda and so on. How did that make you feel when there was suspicion cast upon you as a journalist doing your job?
Actually, for me as a Syrian, I'm not feeling what you're talking about this now. Because, I know since the beginning, the enemy for the regime to make her propaganda for reality, or to confuse the people like what's going on now, that's the camera. That's his first enemy. So he was always killing the people who filming, always, even in the civil protesting.
Idris, I want to ask you about comparisons. As people have been drawing attention to Aleppo and have been talking about this collective guilt and collective shame, they've been mentioning Srebrenica, they've been mentioning the Holocaust, Guernica, some people Stalingrad. There have been people who have been quite sort of loose with the term genocide, and legally you can agree or disagree with that. Has all of that been helpful or harmful?
No, I think comparisons are helpful. I mean, unless they are exaggerated. I mean, and in this case, I think the Bosnia example is quite telling because something similar happened there. That we had several years in which there was collective inaction, and in the end, it turned out how little it took, or how quickly that conflict, which was as bloody as it was for all those years, that how quickly it could be ended, just when the world stopped being indifferent. And in this case as well, I think that there is that sense that if in 2013, August 2013, when there was a justification and where there was a will to do something, things might have turned out differently. In fact, that was a trigger point. I think after August 13, you see a whole lot of dynamics shifting. You see suddenly the discrediting of the nationalist opposition. You see suddenly the rise of the Islamist groups. Then you see suddenly that the exodus and all of these massive changes that happened since then. Then Iran intervened in a more significant way. After that, then Russia intervened in a significant way. So I think that vacuum that was created in August 2013, that was very significant. So the Bosnia example in that respect is telling. And Guernica again becomes telling for the same reason that you have got this alliance now of these states, and quite fascistic in terms of their character. And what's happening is that they are, I mean, certainly the regime that they're supporting is quite fascistic in its character. So the reason why that those examples are brought up is that Bosnia was an example, Srebrenica was an example of a tolerated atrocity. And Aleppo now has become, in fact, it has replaced, and it's replaced on a far larger scale, that this is a tolerated atrocity. And if it's tolerated, that becomes a license. And now the regime is talking about, Assad has just given a statement saying that the victory, quote unquote, their liberation of Aleppo is now going to be repeated in Idlib. So all the people who have just made out of Aleppo, so they will be under renewed assault in a different place, just because the regime has been emboldened by what it got away with.
Idris, I want to jump in here and ask a final question of Wael, because we are running out of time. Someone who presumably can do something is the UN Secretary General. Ban Ki-moon, in his final speech on his way out, said, quote, "My deepest regret on leaving office is the continuing nightmare in Syria." And he went on, he said, "I once again plead with all of you to cooperate and fulfill your collective responsibility to protect Syrian civilians." And I read that and I thought, now if this guy can't do anything, because that seemed to be complete resignation, like, look, I tried, I can't do anything, I hope somebody else solves it. If this guy, the Secretary General of the United Nations, can't do anything, what can my grandmother do watching
Nothing.
Watching this? What can anybody do this? What can somebody who wants to do something, who's outraged?
Nothing. This is why we're talking about this is the shameful time for the United Nations in the history. So no one can do anything because everyone do his propaganda following his own benefit, like the Russian and the Syrian and the others. The Chinese, 6-time or 5-time veto.
Yeah.
This is shameful. So people dying. And as you said, the secretary, he cannot do anything. Is his top concern? I don't know.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. Wael Al Harba and Idris Ahmed, it's been a pleasure talking to both of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.